Hi everyone, it's Shirley here. Today I'm going to be working on Yvette's Perfectly Pieced Project Box Halloween 2021. The project box contains your pattern booklet, vellum copies, and your fabrics. Okay, what we're looking at right now is the pattern booklet and our vellum copies that we received in our project box. What I noticed when I took out page 5 from my pattern pieces and I took the vellum copies and I placed the vellum copy over top of my pattern from the booklet, I noticed that the pattern pieces that were made from the vellum are smaller than the booklet. So your project, if you use your vellum pieces, they are going to be, your whole project is going to end up smaller than if you use your pattern pieces. So what I chose to do was I chose to make copies from my booklet, and I put them into my printer and I made sure that I had my copies printed at 100%. I'm looking at page 3 from the pattern booklet. What I did was I went ahead and made a paper copy, color copy of the fabric requirements. What I did then was I measured my piece of fabric, made a note of it on my paper. I then went ahead and serged the edges, washed and dried my fabric, gave it a light spray starch, ironed it, and then remeasured. I made another note on here of the fabric after it was washed, and then made a little label for my fabric. Now, if you don't pre-wash or anything like that, that's fine. From the pattern booklet, I have taken page 23 and 27. I'm going to be working on what I think is the easiest piece to put together. I'm going to be needing pattern pieces to cut out my fabrics. So what I did in order to determine what pieces I'm going to be needing to cut my fabric pieces, I've used a light box and I have taken my page 23 and made a paper copy of it. From that paper copy, I have referred to it in the booklet from page 27. Or for fabric placement for your colors, I'm going to be using a light box, so I'm going to turn that on. If you don't have a light box, you can use any kind of a light source to get the pattern placements. Right now I'm looking at the printed side. For my color placement, I'm going to flip it over, look at my page 27 with the corresponding section. From that, I determined that AS1, which is right here, should be pink. So I took my pink pencil crayon, turned it over, and then I colored in section AS1. I then proceeded on to AS4, which was orange, and colored in AS4 with orange. And off to the side here, this is what I have come up with. Remember, this is the printed side I colored in, and on this side, it looks exactly like the picture on page 27. This is the piece that I am going to be using to cut my pattern pieces to be able to cut my fabrics. Okay, I have page 23 colored in on my copy paper. This, like I said, is going to be used to cut pattern pieces to be able to cut my fabrics. I now need a copy to use as my paper piecing. So that is going to be what I'm going to call my stitching pattern. So I am going to be using freezer paper, and again, you can use whatever you want, whatever you prefer. I'm going to be using the freezer paper. So what I did was I took my freezer paper and my pattern piece to my light box and placed my freezer paper on the printed side, placed it, and just with a pencil I just traced all the pattern piece, and I colored in what colors I'm going to be using. Remember, we're going to be putting our fabrics on the wrong side of the piece. If you're not going to be using freezer paper, what you could do at this time is just make another copy of this and use printer paper to do your piecing. Pieces. So again, here I have my reference guide, my colored copy for cutting out my pattern pieces, and my copies for piecing the fabric pieces together. Okay, so then what I do is I just take a ruler, a separate rotary cutting blade, or a separate rotary cutter to cut out my paper pieces. I don't want to use my good rotary cutter that I use for fabric. So to do the pieces for cutting out our fabric is I just start out by cutting out along the edges of the pattern piece. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is anything that's not colored in is going to be using our white fabric. Okay, so I have my piece cut out, and I have cut out along the dotted edge. The solid black line is your seam allowance. So now all I'm going to do is the two pieces on each side are going to be white fabric. So I am going to cut those off. So that's going to be from my white fabric. Okay, I have both of my pieces now for my white fabric. Now I'm going to cut out the colored pieces. So along each one of these lines, I am going to cut them apart. Cutting right on that black line. And again, your cutting pieces are not, they don't need to be as accurate as when you're sewing pieces together. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to cut along the outside of each one of these. And I know they're little pieces, so you might want to have a little container. I usually have a little container that I just use to set all my pieces in. So I would take and put all of those into my little container, and then that way they don't get lost. So again, I'm going to cut this one off. And set it in my little bucket for my white pieces. Now, I'm not going to, pardon me, I'm not going to be editing unless I really mess up, but because I want you to be able to see everything as I go along, and hopefully it will make sense to you. So white pieces go in the bucket, colored pieces up there. And I'll try to work as quickly as I can. And like I said, you don't have to be real accurate on cutting these pieces out. Okay, and remember we're working with AS right in this section here. So I have all my white pieces over there, and I have all my colored pieces here. So now remember that when we go to cut our pieces, I'll just show you this here. Remember, this is what it should look like finished. So if I turn this over, and if you hold it up to the light, you can see where our pattern or our fabric pieces are going to go on this side. So you always have to remember to cut your pieces with the printed side up and the wrong side of your fabric. So the first piece I'm going to start with is AS1. So AS1 will refer to this, and it's going to be right here. So I'm going to take my pink fabric, and I have a piece just a piece cut. It measures about, let's see here. It's about 4 inches. I'm going to take my pink piece and I am going to lay it down on my fabric and wrong side up. So we're going to lay it down on here. What we want with our fabric pieces, now this is a seam allowance. If you look at this, our bias edges, if we lay it on like that, this is going to be a bias edge and this is going to be a bias edge. What I try to do is place my fabric piece so that I don't have a bias on the outside. If I placed my piece like this, this would be a bias. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it either this way or this way so that these are not on the bias. Now, if you have a glue stick, you can take a little piece of glue or a glue stick. My glue stick doesn't work all that well. I have dollar store glue stick and it's not the best. So I'm just going to put a little bit of glue stick on the back and place it on there so that I have at least a 1/2 inch all the way around. I'm just going to use a bigger ruler here so that you can see there. Okay. There we go. Okay. So now you can see on my ruler that my 1/4 inch is right here, my 3/8 of an inch is right there, and my 1/2 inch is right there. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to add a 1/2 inch just to be sure. So I have my ruler laying so that my 1/2 inch is right on the edge of that cut edge. And with my rotary cutter, I am just going to do a cut. I'm going to turn this now and lay my 1/2 inch on there. And I'm going to lay my, so I've got a 1/2 inch here, and I've got a 1/2 inch here. And I'm just going to cut like so. And I didn't cut all the way through, so I'm going to go back and just do that again. I'm just going to cut this again. There we go. So now I have my first, get in frame here, I have my first piece cut. And again, I probably could have left a little bit more on this edge. On this particular piece, there is a 1/4 inch, which is our seam allowance, and then I've left extra there. So now what I'm going to do is it does have glue on it, but I am going to take a pin and I'm just going to place the pin in there and put it in my little bucket here. Okay, we're done with our pink. Now we're going to go on to our orange. Okay, so again, a 1/2 inch on all sides. Okay, and I'm just going to cut across here. So again, a 1/2 inch away from the cut edge. So now I've done AS4, and that goes in my little bucket. I'm going to set aside my fabric, and we're going to do the same thing with our other pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera, and I'll be back and show you the next step. Okay, we're going to be cutting out our white pieces now. And what I have in front of me is I have my pattern, my fabric, and my white pieces. And I've laid them out so they're corresponding with my pattern. So I've got a little piece of white paper here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the two pieces, AS14 and AS15. Because they have the seam allowances on the outside, I'm going to use those two pieces to do this next little piece, how I determine how I'm going to cut my white fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and with my little ruler, I'm just going to draw a pencil line down the one side of this this paper. So, and then I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch from the bottom. Draw my line, and now I'm going to put that piece right on there. Then I'm going to draw a 1/2 inch on that side. So now I have this piece and this piece. I'm going to mark a little X on. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and place my ruler so that I have my 1/2 inch mark along the cut edge of that pattern piece. And you can't see it because I've cut the little black line, but it's right there. Okay, so I didn't get that quite there, did I? Okay. I'm just going to draw that line there so you can see. Okay. How about if we draw that line properly? Okay. So there I have it positioned in there. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to draw another line a 1/2 inch away from there. Place my ruler on and draw. So all of this is going to be what I allow on the opposite side. So now I'm going to take A14 and I'm going to place it on here. Nope, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw another line a 1/2 inch away from there. Okay, now that's what I want. Okay, so I have a 1/2 inch on all sides of this pattern piece. I'm going to take my next pattern piece and place it on, and hopefully it'll stay there. I'll just draw it on here so that you can see. Okay, so that's going to be where the placement for my next pattern piece is. And now, there we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a 1/2 inch away from those cut edges, or those edges. This might not make sense right now, but hopefully it will soon. Okay. So these are the areas that I need. I'll just extend this little line across here. Okay, bias and bias. So with my little rotary cutter that I use for cutting my paper, I'm just going to cut and cut on this line so I don't have any extra little pieces that are going to confuse me or confuse you. So, and I've determined that all of these pieces here are going to be the same size. They're all the same. So now, if I take this and cut it along there, and for this, I'm just going to show you if I can get that up. There we go. When we fold this together, it's a square. Okay? So this is how I determine how I use less fabric when I'm cutting out. So this is the fabric that I need, and this is the fabric that I need. Everything else on the outside, is the extra. So when I measure this, I need a piece that is 3 inches. And it should be 3 inches by 3 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other pieces and I'm going to see, okay, that piece is going to fit on there. So if I cut a strip that is 3 inches, I should be able to get all my pieces cut out. So with my white fabric laying here, I'm going to take my larger ruler, take my white fabric, and I'm going to just turn it so I'm not cutting across myself, and I'm going to cut a strip that is 3 inches. So with my rotary cutter, I'm going to cut off a piece that is 3 inches. Make sure that's cutting. I need a new blade in my rotary cutter. Okay. So I have a strip of fabric now cut 3 inches by the width of the fabric. And I'm going to cut off my selvage. Let's get in frame here. I'm going to set my large piece of fabric over to the side and cut off my selvage edges. Now, so if I took this piece now and laid it on, you can see if I lay AS15 down here and AS14 here and cut it along there, I will have all sides with extra fabric, and I will have my bias edges where I want them to be. So now if I cut off a 3-inch piece and get my large ruler, place those back on there, and that's just how I determined the size of strip and everything I need for this particular or these particular pattern pieces. So I'm just going to turn this now. And I'm cutting 2 layers at a time, just to get my 3-inch pieces. So how many 3-inch pieces am I going to need? I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. And because I'm cutting 2 layers, I'm going to cut another 3-inch piece. For the last one that I need, I'm going to cut 1 layer. And if I've done my calculation correct, and place all my pieces so that they're wrong side up, and again, these do not have to be real accurate, because we've got that extra fabric on the side, on all sides of our piece. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ruler and place it on the diagonal like this, cut through all those pieces, and now lay them out, wrong side of the fabric facing up, and just take my pieces and lay them so they correspond to the pattern piece. And there you can see everything is laying in the right direction. I've got my extra fabric all the way on the outside, and now this one's going to go like this. Pin those on. Making sure that I place my bias edge along there. And those pieces are going to be all done. Okay, off camera, I am just going to go and finish putting my pieces on to the fabrics, and I'll be back and show you cutting out these 2 pieces. Okay, I've cut my pattern pieces for these ones, and I've laid them out so that they are in number order. Okay, so the next piece I'm going to cut is A16. I'm going to put a little glue stick on the back of that. Place it on my piece of fabric, and remember the white and the black, there is no right and wrong side, so you just need to place it on there, making sure that you have enough on all sides that there's a 1/2 inch around. So now I'm just going to take and cut off a 1/2 inch from the seam line. And I'll give you the measurement of that. You can make a note of it if you like on your pattern here. For these pieces, you'll need a 3-inch strip, and your 3-inch strip will also be able to cut this. So this is a 3-inch strip. And then we just need this piece right here. Okay, now we're going to take our A17 and do the same thing. I'm going to place it so that I have a 1/2 inch all the way around from my seam line. So now I'm just going to take and cut a 1/2 inch away from my seam line on this side. So my strip that I'm using for here is approximately about 6.5 inches, because this is a 6-inch ruler. So it's about 6.5 inches long by 3 inches wide. And you can just make a note on that, 6 by 3. And this one is 6.5, pardon me, 6.5. And this one here is 6.5 by, take my ruler, line it up again so the 1/2 inch mark is away from that seam line. Cut that off. And if we look at this, we can see that I think it's just about, yep. So now we've got another piece or another section that is going to be identical to this, only in the reverse. So this piece can be used for that piece right there. So I'm going to set my pieces off to the side. And again, you can mark on your pattern piece, or you can mark it on your cutting piece. So this is 6.5 by 3. And this is approximately 6.5 by 1.5. Make sense? I hope so. I hope I haven't confused you. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to lay my pieces out, and I'm going to lay them out in the order that they're going to be sewn. So here I have my pieces, my colored pieces. So I am going to lay these out. The first piece I'm going to be using is A1 when I go to stitch this on. So A1, A2, A3, and I'm going to put them all in order of the number. Just picking them up, laying them face down. Okay. Okay, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Now I'm all ready to stitch those up at the machine. I won't have to do any more cutting of fabric pieces or anything like that. They're all in order now, and I can just go ahead to my machine and sew them together. So I'll be back and show you that in just a moment. Okay, I'm set up beside my sewing machine. I have a little area on a table beside my sewing machine that I do my cutting and my pressing. And what I have in front of me is the piecing or the stitching paper. And I'm going to be using freezer paper, but for this I'm going to be showing you on copy paper what I do with my stitching pattern. I will be folding the pattern pieces along the fold line of all the lines, and I use a piece of stencil plastic, and I just line up that stencil plastic along the stitching line of the paper pattern, and I just fold in creases all the way along. So whether you're using freezer paper, copy paper, or whatever you're using, you'll do the same thing. And I have mine already done, and it's folded on all the lines. So every single one of those stitching lines has a fold on it. Okay, now I'm going to go through a few things that I have on my table that I'm going to be using, and I'll go through those one at a time quickly, and then during the video you'll see how I use them. Beside my sewing machine, I've set up my rotary cutting mat. I have a wool pressing mat, and I'm going to be using a little Dritz iron. The next thing I'm going to need, we'll be needing a add a quarter ruler, thread snips, rotary cutter, a little pressing roller, pins, glue stick, and I am going to be using my FAF 4.5 Creative, and I'm going to be using a Microtex chrome needle, size 80-12. I have some glue stick, pins, wonder clips, and then in my little cup above here I have all my other little tools that I might be needing. And again, I've got them put into my piecing it reel. This is my little container that I use for all my paper piecing. Okay, the other thing I have is my containers. This one has all my pattern pieces in it. This was I'm going to use for my threads that I cut off, and I set that by my sewing machine. And this one is going to be for my little cut off pieces, and that I put on my ironing board just above my cutting surface. In front of me I have two presser feet, and the one I'm going to be using is what they call a stitch in the ditch foot. The stitch in the ditch foot has a little metal piece that runs right along your stitching line, The other one I have in front of me is a clear regular stitching foot, and it is clear so that you can see where your stitching line is. So the one I'm choosing to use right now is the Stitch in the Ditch foot. The last product I have on my table that I use for my foundation paper piecing is a product called Easy Press Fabric Treatment from Acorn. It comes in an Easy Press pen, or you can use it in a mister bottle. I prefer to put mine into a water brush, and it gives me the right amount of liquid on my seams. I apply it to all my seams when I foundation paper piece because it leaves the seams very, very flat. So let's start stitching. In front of me I have my freezer paper copy, my stitching copy, and beside me I have page 27. And again, like I said, we're going to be making this block right here. I have my pattern pieces all ready to stitch together, and the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to take AS1, which is our first piece, and I'm going to place that first piece on my pattern. AS1 is going to go there, but it goes on the wrong side. So there is my AS1, and I can see my lines there. I'm going to place my first piece wrong side against the pattern. And because this is freezer paper, I can just simply take it to my iron and press, and the freezer paper is going to stick that piece down. If you're not using freezer paper, you can use a little glue stick, and you can use the glue stick and put your piece on. So now the next thing I do is I take my piece and I am going to be folding it between AS1 and AS2. So I'm going to fold that. I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to fold between AS1 and AS2. Fold my paper back and crease along that line. With my 1/4 inch ruler, I'm going to take and butt the edge right up against that fold and cut off any excess. And I know that I've got plenty of fabric on all my sides. And you want to make sure your fabric is extending beyond this line or your cutting line right there. So we're going to fold this back, place my ruler on, and cut along there. I have my little basket here where I put all my little cut off pieces. Then what I'm going to do is take the next piece, which is my white AS2, and I'm going to place it right side together. We have our right side up. If this was a pattern piece, you'd want to make sure that you have the right side facing up. Because it's white, you don't have to worry about that. So I'm just going to place it on there, right up against the cut edge, matching the cut edges. Now, if you want, you can put a little pin, but I don't. I can just take it to my sewing machine now, and what I'm going to be doing is stitching right along the edge of that folded piece. If you are going to stitch through your paper, when you take it to the sewing machine, you will be turning this over and stitching right along the line between AS1 and AS2. Because I'm not going to be stitching through my paper, and the reason I don't stitch through my paper is because then I have to do a little back stitch. Because there's so many small pieces on this particular project, that's why I'm not stitching through the paper, because I'd have to back stitch and tear in my paper and everything. But if you're using that way, then what you'll do is you will stitch right on that line coming right off. I'm going to be using a 1.5 stitch length for my sewing machine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, fold it back like I said, and doing it this way, you can start stitching right along here and stitch all the way to the end, and then you don't have to worry about back stitching. So I'll get set up now at the sewing machine, and I'll show you how I stitch that on. Okay, I'm set up at my sewing machine, and what I'm going to do is I am going to place my pieces underneath the presser foot, and I'm lining up my little guide there right along the edge of that folded pattern piece. So now I am going to start right off the edge, and I am going to stitch all the way along, and I need to lower my stitch length to 1.5. Using this method, you don't have to back stitch. I've stitched all the way off the end. Going to cut my threads. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to take this back to my pressing surface and press, and I'll take you over there and show you that. I'm back at my pressing and cutting surface, and this is exactly how I stitched along that line. And if I turn it over, you'll be able to see my stitching line right along there. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to fold my paper back, turn it over. Now I've filled the water brush with the precision piecing fabric treatment, and this stuff really works well. So in the water brush, I've filled it all up, and then what I do is I squeeze it, and it makes the brush wet. Don't know whether you can see that, but it's wet now. You don't need a lot of this. Don't saturate your seam. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and just run the brush along that seam. And again, you don't want to oversaturate it. A little bit goes a long, long way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press that piece to the right side, And then you could either finger press it, or you can use your seam roller. And I have found that just finger pressing it works fine. Now, because I'm using the freezer paper, when I press this, my fabric piece is going to attach to that pattern piece, and I don't have to use a glue stick. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it, and you'll know when you go to press this and everything how flat the seam stays. So I'm going to take it to my pressing surface, and my little iron has cut out, so, and I have this iron set on 4. And I'm just going to lightly press so that that pattern piece stays in its position. Make sure you don't press on the freezer paper itself. You're just going to be pressing along the seam line and along the edges of the fabric. I'm going to turn it over and press it from the printed side of my piece, and my AS2 is right there, so that is the piece I know that's white. So I can just press that from this side, and now I'll show you that that's not going anywhere. All my edges are down flat. So the next step is to turn our paper over. We want to be now sewing with AS3. And because I've gone ahead and put them in order, I can easily pick them up and put them where they need to be. So what I'm going to do now is fold between AS1 and AS3. Fold my paper pattern back along that line, and you'll see where the freezer paper, my fabric has attached to the freezer paper, and I have stitched through there a little bit, but that's okay, it just comes off quite nicely. And if you stitch through your paper, don't worry about it, it'll just tear off easily. Now I have it folded back like that. I'm going to take my add a quarter ruler. I'm going to place it along the edge, the folded edge of the pattern paper, and I'm going to trim off. And that goes in my little bucket. I now have a 1/4 inch seam on here. I now am going to take AS3, which when I look on this side, my AS3 is white. Fold it back like this, and I'm going to place this piece so that my edges are lined up. Now I'm going to take this to the machine again, and I'm going to stitch right along that folded edge again. I'm going to start off and come right through to the end. So I'll set up at the sewing machine again, and I'll show you that. Okay, I am now stitching on AS3. So I'm going to be folding this back like I did, and now I'm going to stitch right along that edge. And again, because I'm using the freezer paper, I don't have to stop and back stitch. I can just stitch right along that line. And I'm using my little edge guide right there to follow along the edge. I'm going to cut my threads. And just off camera here at the edge of my sewing machine, I do have my little bucket for my thread cutoffs. Okay, now we're going to go back to the cutting table, and I am going to show you how to add on AS4. Okay, we're back at the cutting and pressing area. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to fold my paper over, and right along that seam line, I am going to use my precision piecing with my water brush, and I'm just going to go along lightly. And you don't need to put a whole bunch on, remember, very, very lightly. I'm going to fold this down, up, underneath, so it's positioned like that. And then I'm just going to take my fingers, press it over, run my fingernail along. You can use your seam roller if you want. And now I'm just going to take it to the iron, and again, like I did before, I'm just going to press in the fabric area to secure that piece in place. Turn it over and just press the area where A3 is. Okay, and remember, don't press your freezer paper because your iron will get all gucked up. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over like this, and if you feel your seams using that precision piecing product, your seams and everything just lay nice and flat. So now I'm going to turn this over, and I'm going to be working on AS4. So AS4, I'm going to fold along the line between AS3, AS2, and AS1. I'm going to fold that back along that stitching line, and I have extra fabric there. I'm going to take and turn it, use my add a quarter ruler, and trim off the excess. So now because I'm working with AS4 and it's right in front of me, I can just pick it up and position it in place. I want it right side up, right side against the previous pieces. I'm going to line that up. And we have plenty of excess fabric on here, so I know it's going to cover that. Remember, if we turn it like this, you'll be able to see how it's in the right position. When I turn it back, you'll see how it's going to go in there nicely. And I don't want to cut my point off, so I don't have to worry about that because I'm sewing right along the edge of the line, or the folded edge, I should say. So now I'm going to fold that back into position, and this is what it should look like when I take it to the sewing machine. When I take it to the sewing machine, I am going to be lining up my edges, my cut edges, and stitching again right from the edge all the way down off of the other edge, right up against that fold. So I'll take you over to the sewing machine and I'll show you that once again. I'm back on the sewing machine, and again I'm going to start right at the edge and stitch all the way along the fold line. Again, trim my threads. And now we have our next piece on. We're going to go back to the cutting and pressing table. Okay, we are at the cutting and pressing area. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to flip this over right along that edge. I am just going to use my precision piecing water here in my brush and just run that brush along the seam line. Fold everything out. And now finger press that back. Give it a little finger press along there. And again, you can use your seam roller. And now you can see I have a beautiful point right there. Nothing's cut off. I have extra fabric. So now again, I'm going to take it to the iron and just press it lightly with the iron. And again, I'm going to remind you, don't press on the freezer paper because it'll get sticky all over your iron. You just want to be pressing on the fabric. And I'm just pressing lightly. I'm going to turn it over. We did AS4, so now all I'm going to do is press the AS4 area. I find the freezer paper will stick better if you press it from the paper side, not the fabric side. Okay, I have that pressed now. It's not going anywhere. It's all stuck down. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to be working with AS5. And I know that's what I'm working with because I've done AS4. So now what I'm going to do is place this so I can read it. And I am now going to be positioning my fabric for between AS4 and AS5. Fold my paper back along there. Use my add a quarter ruler. Trim. And I know I forgot to close the blade on my rotary cutter. So now what we need is AS5. We pick it up from our little basket. And again, we're going to be placing right sides together so we know the wrong side is on the opposite side because we placed this on the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm going to lay it down like that. Take my pin out, take away my pattern piece, lay it down, match the cut edges, and take it to the sewing machine, and again, start right off the edge, come all the way down, and stitch right along the folded edge. Okay, I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to go and stitch that together. If you have any questions, make sure you put it in the comment section below the video. If you'd like me to show you how I stitch all the seams, just let me know in the comment section. but otherwise I'm not going to be showing you each stitching at the sewing machine. So I'll pause the video here and I'll go stitch that up, and I'll be back to show you the next step. Okay, I've stitched on AS5. I'm now going to, again, you can fold it out like this. Run your brush across the seam. And if you feel there is enough moisture on there to activate the product, give it a light finger press. And we now have that in place. We're going to take it to the iron. Give it a light press along the seam. Turn it over and press just where AS5 is. And now take it back to the cutting surface. And now we're going to be adding on AS6. And because I've placed my pattern pieces in order, I know exactly which piece I'm going to be working on next, and then I don't get confused. It may not make sense right now, but when you go to do those tiny little pieces, it is going to really help with getting this put together quickly. So now I'm going to fold it back over. I'm working with AS6. I'm going to fold it along that line between AS4 and AS6. Fold it back along the stitching line. Take your 1/4 ruler, butt it up against the folded edge, and trim off the excess. We're now going to be taking AS6, take that, right side up, right sides together, line up the cut edges, and take it to the sewing machine. And I'll be back. I've stitched on AS6, so now I'm going to again place it flat, take my water brush, run it along the seam line, finger press it into position, and then take it to the iron. Press on the right side, turn it over, press just where AS6 is, take it back to the cutting. We're working on AS7. We'll turn it over, AS7, AS7, fold it back along that line. And you can see, one thing I want to show you right now is that you can see that when I added the 1/2 inch, that has given me plenty of excess fabric to be able to trim this down. That's why I can use 3/8 of an inch. I'll have less along this edge to trim off, and I'll be saving some fabric. But I preferred to add the 1/2 inch just so you could see it better on the video. Now trim. Take our AS7 piece, and again that's going to go right sides together, right along that edge. Take my pin out, pattern piece off, fold it back, make sure my cut edges are lined up, And again, take it back to the sewing machine and stitch again right along this line. Okay, I've now stitched on AS7. Turn it over. Turn it into the right position. Put my precision piecing on there. Fold it into the correct position and press. Press from the wrong side. Take it over. We're now going to be working with AS8. Turn it over. Fold along the line between AS7 and AS8. Place the add a quarter. Trim off. And now we're going to add AS8. Right sides together. Fold back so we can see where we need to be stitching, and again stitching right along the folded edge. I'll take that to the sewing machine and I'll be right back. I now have AS8 stitched into position. I'm now going to fold it out. Use my precision piecing in the water brush and just run it along the edge. And again, take it to the sewing machine, take it to the iron. Finger press it back. Bring it back. We are now going to be working with AS9. I'm going to fold it over, press along the line between AS7 and AS9, fold that back, add a quarter ruler up against the edge, trim. Now take AS9, right sides together, line up the cut edges, take it to the sewing machine, and stitch down that edge along the edge of the folded paper. And so I'll take that to the sewing machine and I'll be back. I've stitched on AS9. I'm now going to do the same thing like I did before, turning it over, use my water brush just along that seam line, finger press to the finished position, take it to the iron, and now we're going to do the same thing again. Turn it over. We're working with AS10. Fold it back along AS10. trim. Add our AS10. Now again, take it to the sewing machine. Okay, I'm going to stop the video right now, and off camera I'm going to finish with my side pieces, and I'll be back to show you the next step. I'm back. I've finished all my pieces, and now what I'm going to do is, once I have this section done right here, I'm going to just flip it over, fold back along the line between A16 and the pieces that I have just sewn together. Fold it back, and with my add a quarter ruler, again, I'm going to place it up against that folded edge and trim. Okay, now we are going to add on A16. So we're going to take our A16, and again we're going to be putting right sides together. So I'm just going to match that up. Match up my cut edges. And take that to the sewing machine again and stitch down that whole length of that piece. I've stitched down my A16, so I'm going to turn it over, use my pen again, and just go all the way down that seam line. Just going to move this out of the way here. Finger press that away. Finger press it down. And look at my points, all nicely done. Okay, now I'm going to just take it to the iron. Fold this back because we're not going to be adding on any other pieces. I have lots of fabric left. So now I'm going to take this to the iron and just press it. And I'm going to press that whole piece down, and it should adhere to the freezer paper. Now I'm going to turn it over, press it from this side, and I'm just pressing the A16 area. Okay, that's pressed into place, and I'm going to now turn this over, and we're going to be stitching down A17 to the side of our triangle pieces. Fold on the line, add a quarter ruler, and trim. we're now going to add on our AS17. Going to take that. Placing right sides together. And now take that to the sewing machine and stitch all the way along. I finished stitching on a 17 to my piece. I'm now going to flip it over. Just flip that up so you can see it. And I'm going to, again, use my brush. And now finger press that into position. I have beautiful points there. Just going to give it a little finger press and then take it over to the iron and press that seam. Turn it over and give it another press. Just going to make sure that this is pressed down really good, because the next step we are going to be trimming around the outside of the block. Okay, there is our block finished. Up to this point, we have all our pieces on. I'm going to now flip this over, and you can see that there's my stitching line, and there is my cutting line. I'm going to take my add a quarter, place that right along that edge. And remember, we want to be cutting on that outside line. And that will leave us our 1/4 inch seam allowance to be able to sew the rest of our pieces on. So I'm just going to trim that. So you can see I've cut all the way along that edge. I'm going to turn it. Line up my add a quarter again, cutting on that outside line. The outside line is our cutting line. The inside line is our stitching line. And again, cut. And trim our last edge. The unit for this section right here, AS, is now complete and looks like the picture. So now we can go on to the next section here, which is AR.